All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to our last Geospatial Forum here in person. We do have the MGIST presentations on May 1st over in Hunt, but this will be our final forum in this new space for us for this academic year. So thanks to all of you who are here in the room. Definitely thanks to Nick for traveling and joining us today. Thanks to the folks online. So Nick Okafor and I met about a year and a half ago. We realized we had a friend in common from our shared time at Washington University in St. Louis and with the Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement. And so we were introduced to each other, though we overlapped for a year or two in St. Louis. We were introduced about 2 years ago, just after he started and founded trubel&co, which you're going to hear a fair amount about today. It's fantastic work. It's really interesting. Nick has had a great career going from an engineering degree at Washington University. He worked for Google and Sidewalk Labs. He's worked at MIT. He's doing an on-again, off-again PhD at Stanford right now in education and engineering, and just is a really great thinker doing important work with communities. And I'm super excited to hear what he has to share with us today. So thanks everyone for coming. I know it's been a big week for CGA. We had the event 2 nights ago with great turnout. And so congrats to all the students, all the faculty and staff on a great year. So thanks to you for being here. Nick, thanks for coming. And I look forward to learning.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Is it all set with the screen? Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick. Super excited to be here and didn't realize this was like the closing out event of the space, and so I was extremely honored to have that opportunity. Always love to start with the quote, if it comes up. And the quote is from Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She's one of my favorite scholars. She's a geographer. She's also an abolitionist and talks a lot about this intersection. And so in doing this work, she shares, is that everything all good with the screen? Is it my computer? The resolution of this. Just 1 second. The other way? Yeah. Perfect. Then slideshow. Sweet. All good? All right. Thanks for the patience. And so I always love to start off with a quote of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a favorite geographer, incredible abolitionist scholar. And she shares that geographers don't make maps. Rather, we ask ourselves, why do things happen where they do? And so I'm here to talk about this concept of liberatory innovation that you probably haven't heard of because, start to lean into the scholarly thing of claiming an abstract term and making a name for yourself in the field. But truly through this lens, I'm trying to explore critical GIS as a tool for civic imagination. A little bit about me. I run a nonprofit called trubel&co, and I'll get into that a bit. I am a graduate student, as Aaron shared, on-again, off-again relationship with my PhD, but ultimately blending the worlds of engineering and education. I'm really interested in responsible innovation, abolitionist tech, and I think I have great music taste. And so I always love to give some great recs. And so Doechii, Bad Bunny, Bronze Avery, check them out. Some of the things that we'll talk about today, I want to introduce this concept of liberatory innovation, but then I also want to dive into abolition. I know some folks may be familiar, some are confused on what does this have to do with technology and GIS, and we'll dive into that. And then finally, thinking through how we might expand some of these possibilities within the world of data. I am a teacher by training, and so there will be interaction, there'll be questions, y'all talk to each other, and so get used to that now, get warmed up, but it'll be kind of a semi-workshop style. To start that off, folks can bring out their phones or just type in at slido.com with trouble. I'm really just curious for everyone in the room and those online, what should liberation blink like? What should it feel like? What should it smell like, taste like, be like, sound like? There are no wrong answers. I just want to get a sense of, as we're describing what liberatory innovation might mean, it means something different to everybody. And so super curious if you're able to log in using the great one is typing. I want to see 20, 30 people typing. And there are no wrong answers because liberation feels, sounds, smells differently to all of us. There are definitely feelings tied to it. Giggles. I love that. There's a joy that's inherently tied to liberation. Yes, joy. There are sounds that are part of it, right? Like when we hear about liberation, there is an empowering feeling tied to it. There's a freedom. Oh, I love this specificity. A sunny summer day with a thunderstorm rolling in. Gathering around and sharing our favorite foods. And so liberation should be collective and done with people. Soil, there's a tangible nature to that. I love that soil has a feeling, a smell, hopefully not a taste. Thinking through peace, confidence, joy, being myself without intimidation. I love this. Keep them coming in. I always love this collection of how other people are interpreting this world of liberation. As those are rolling in, second question. You can interpret this however you want, but where do you call home? This could be, right here. This could be where you're from. I've called a lot of places home. Home can be temporary. Home can be digital and tangible, right? Like for a little while, especially during the pandemic, IG was my own little home of my friends and a little community there. So I'm curious, and it could be just associations with people as well. And so it'll be with the same Slido link, slido.com, trouble. And so I see with my wife, Rally, the mountains, my friend's house, right? I love just showing up and being with a friend to do nothing. That's a home for me. Nature, where we've lived, in ourselves, right? We carry our homes with us, which is really special. Colombia, I love that. I currently live in Mexico City. My house in the Apex, hometown, North Carolina, PR, amazing with friends. And so we're seeing this spectrum of what liberation means, what liberation feels like, and this other area of places. And so something, just for time, just something to think about, like as we're associating and exploring these areas, I want people to consider, because we're in, the CGA, Center of Geospatial Analytics, so we can't forget about the spatial. So oftentimes with these homes, not everyone knows everything about those homes. Maybe sometimes we think we do. I'm not from here, but I have a conception of Raleigh in North Carolina. And so there are things that I may not get right about those homes. And something to consider as we're exploring the tangibility and the flexibility of the spaces we encounter. And an additional reflection, all of those spaces and places, whether physical and tangible, digital, they can enable some of these senses of liberation. We already got a sense of that, right? Some folks describe these very beautiful scenic imagery of being in the thunderstorm, being with people. And so as we are designing spaces, as we are taking data and understanding our relationship to those places, always like to kind of bridge that gap on how those spaces and places could drive those feelings of liberation that we explored. And so I wanted to show a little bit about my history and how I kind of got here today. As Aaron mentioned, I went to Wash U in the beautiful St. Louis, Missouri, and that's where I really started to first cobble together this idea of liberatory innovation. I grew up as a kid wanting to build cool stuff that help people, and so I'm like, let me learn engineering. I can build really cool things, but I also wanted to understand how society works. And so I cobbled that together with another major in international development. That brought me to the beautiful Brazil. I was in Salvador, Brazil, and that's where I really fell in love with urbanism. I got to study informal urbanism at the site as favelas were thriving, growing, but also facing its own conflicts. And so that's where I really kind of discovered this term or created this term, development aggression. How can you go into a community with the best of intentions, oftentimes for development, but then lead to harm unintentionally? And so we were seeing an encounter within Brazil where, the government and other bodies were going in saying, we want to develop these favelas, these informal slums. We're going to give you new homes. didn't go about how they intended, right? They weren't as community engaged. They said, why are they mad? We gave them new houses. We checked the box. But oftentimes you can go in with those intentions, intent to develop, but the community may not be receptive. And so it opens up this exploration of how technology and development and innovation can be nuanced. Even though you can see on the outer shell the positivity, it can have negative interactions underneath. I also had some time in Kenya, in Nairobi. I spent a year making fire for a living. I was a design researcher for a local startup that built cook stoves. And so that's where I started to really fall in love with like products and really lean more into the creation of things that were tangible that people could interact with. That brought me to DC. I was a consultant. And during that time, I'll say I actually got the chance to work with Planned Parenthood, which is where I learned GIS. I always feel like a little bit of an imposter in rooms like this, right? We're at the center of geospatial analytics, and I kind of like self-taught myself GIS for a job in like 4 weeks, and that was the extent of my knowledge. I kind of took all of that and put it in a 6-week high school class, and so I'm confident you all are more technically literate in this work, but hopefully my work will show you a little bit about how that can expand to various themes and topics. That eventually brought me to Sidewalk Labs, a Google-based urban innovation firm thinking about how we can create products and services that makes living in cities more sustainable, affordable, and inclusive. And then all of that kind of wrapped up to me starting a PhD, blending management, science, and education, trying to think through how are folks innovating responsibly. And I got to ask myself a lot of great questions. That brought me to build Trouble&Co. We are a tech justice nonprofit that mobilizes the next generation to reclaim data, design, and technology to drive advocacy and digital storytelling. And so I wanted to think through my experiences in giving back, my experiences in education, and what was that, the curriculum that I wanted when I was at WashU or even in high school that could blend these worlds and how we could provide that for more people. But I've been saying liberatory innovation for a bit, needs a definition, and so I wanted to dive into like, what I'm referencing there. Innovation probably feels more familiar, right? We're smart folks. We know this world of digital innovation, especially in data design and tech. Stanford defines innovation as the practice of improving standard structures while overcoming the dominating views that may limit progress, a struggle of the new versus the known. And so as I'm thinking about innovation, it's often in this lens of problem solving, often in this lens of I'm creating something new to tackle this issue that I've seen. And in today's world, it's often the digital space. And so you see it in computing and AI, engineering, data science, geospatial analytics. And so we're in this innovative fields. But I often felt that in my education, this was kept separate from the world of liberation. This is one of my favorite definitions of collective liberation. Can I get a volunteer to read the quote? Yeah.
Collective liberation means recognizing that all of our struggles are intimately connected, and that we must work together to create the kind of world we know is possible. When combined, our diverse identities and experiences give us the tools to dismantle systems of economic, political, and social oppression, and to create a world in which all people are seen as fully human.
Thank you so much. I love this definition. I'm going to revisit these parts that are bolded. We must work together to create the kind of world we know is possible. For me, that is so inspiring. We get to think through and create things that don't exist yet. We are diving into things that we know we can get there, but we're not there yet. But we're working together in order to make that difference. Finally, we're creating a world in which all people are seen as fully human. Oftentimes our work in Trouble&Co gets radicalized or politicized. And when we hear the word liberation, oftentimes, especially in this political climate, it's seen as far left, as egregious. But ultimately, we just want everyone to be seen as fully human. We're trying to create a world where everyone can lean in to their own agency and be free. And for me, I start to break this down into these concepts of equity, responsibility, and justice. The reason I do so is I feel like each of these words does something individual and unique for the world of liberation. Equity in creating positive impact, responsibility and thinking through the ways we can mitigate potential harm, and justice through a lens through which we can correct potential systems. There are a lot of different, related concepts, ethics, fairness, bias, and a lot of critical frameworks that align to liberation, but my favorite is through abolition. When I'm thinking through these liberatory frameworks, I see a way to connect it to innovation in order to actually understand its impact on society. Through equity, we're looking at this positive impact. We have familiar terms such as social innovation, human-centered design, promoting access, all of these things of ways that we can create positive impact for the communities around us. Then there's the world of responsibility. How do you mitigate this harm? Oftentimes, this is a separate bucket of work, sometimes overlapping, but its core goal there is thinking through how are we engaging in ethical practice, reduce bias, and engaging in responsible tech design. And then justice. This is the piece that's often left out of the boat when we think about some of the emerging concepts within this world, but it enables an opportunity to dive into system redesign. How can you shift policy, remove barriers, and ultimately disrupt power to ensure that we can keep going towards equity and we have to do less to mitigate some of the harm? And so when we consider how this fits within the world of geospatial analytics, within equity, we might explore the ways that data-driven solutions are expanding equity, impact, and access. How might the maps and dashboards and analyses we create help create positive impact for our communities? We also need to consider the responsible elements of it all. Are there certain guardrails within technology and data that need to be deployed? How might this tool be repurposed for harm? What could be the unintended consequences of putting this information out there? And so there are additional questions for us to ask ourselves as we engage in this work. And then finally, justice. We need to consider which systems or policies are going to shape or constrain the way that society is tackling public benefit. So I bring these three concepts together to kind of explore this world of liberatory innovation. And so in a lot of my world, especially my background, I think a lot about urban technology. And what originally drew me into academia is because I could just sit and think and discuss, which sounded really exciting. And I got to explore this intersection of these four worlds, and most of these are probably pretty familiar to you. There's the natural world, right? I know we're hosted within the college Department of Natural Resources, but then how does that intersect with our built environment? When we think about urban planning, buildings, all the resources that we're using in order to be in a beautiful building like this, how do those overlap or even come into conflict? Then we often see the overlapping of the social world. How does the social infrastructure between us, our connections and how we interact, it may not be as tangible, as the natural built environment, but definitely affects how we navigate through the world and is another environment to consider as we think through our analysis. And then for me, the exciting part is then you have the overlapping of the digital. And so I see this interlapping of environments as a way to really consider the ways that there are a lot of complex structures at play. We have to consider, what is naturally growing and how do we protect that environment? How is what we're building on top of that, affecting its longevity, and how our social and digital infrastructure is shaping the ways we navigate. But I love it because it really lets us inform the future of geospatial analytics. We get to ask really incredible questions about ways that these environments are intersecting. What disparities within urban planning might resurface in digital infrastructure? We get to study in urban planning things like redlining and gentrification and different forms of bias there. That gets reappropriated into the digital infrastructure without knowing. And so how might we learn from the past as we're building this new environment that's overlapping into the world we live in? When does real estate development for big tech encroach public benefit? What is the line between urban safety and surveillance capitalism? A lot of questions that we get to sit and answer and convey. And so as you all are engaging in your work, in your research, in your studies, I encourage you to consider this intersection of environments, because we might be able to push ourselves and say, who's accountable to curate and manage public information about our world? How does our digital society impact the natural world? We're seeing the increase in AI, and that has a big drain on the environment. And so it's important to really consider these environments as we are moving forward as analysts and innovators. But in terms of grounding this in abolitionist strategy, promise is my final poll. I wanted to see what your first thoughts are around the word abolition. Some of you might be familiar, some of you might have questions. Again, no wrong answer. It's just helpful for me to kind of understand where are folks coming from and what are they bringing into the space as we start to explore what abolitionist strategy might mean. The tall order. It's a lot to ask for sure. But I think it's possible, and that is the belief that's going to get us there. Community. slavery definitely has its like a core, its core definition, you know, the abolition of slavery. There's a powerlessness, right? Or a powerlessness that it's fighting in order to get there. Freedom, correcting past wrongs, historical practices. We need to listen to Black women. I'll say it again. We need to listen to Black women. There's a piece about restoration. It's been tied to slavery, alcohol prohibition, change, dismantling systems that marginalize communities. These are all really great. And restructuring systems to meet all types of people. I really love the diversity of thought that's being brought here. I use this definition from Miriam Kaba, who's another renowned abolitionist scholar, and she firstly describes it as a constant becoming. A constant becoming. She later follows that up by saying that abolition is a political vision, a structural analysis of oppression, and a practical organizing strategy. And so this is the core framework, often informed by prison industrial complex abolitionist strategy of like how they are approaching this work. When you break it down, when I look at a concept becoming, I see this iterative approach. I see this opportunity to accept that we're never there. It's always a process. Abolition isn't a checkbox, neither is liberation, right? It's a thing that we are constantly working on. We're looking at ourselves, we're looking at the people around us, and we're trying to be better, but it's constantly iterating. Finally, she grounds it here with the vision, analysis of oppression, and an organizing strategy. So she pushes us to think through what is this ideal future that we want to work towards? What's the harm that needs to be repaired in order for us to really understand our past? And what tools are needed to get there, to go from that past to that future? In my work, I really see how abolition follows this iterative method of building to reach the goal of liberation akin to the innovation process. And so in the past, they're analyzing the structural oppression. In my work as a design researcher, there's a lot of reflection, there's analysis, there's storytelling. I get to ensure that this past is documented. And as geospatial analysts, we get to document that. We're preserving and documenting the things that have happened, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and ensuring that that work gets done. And we're analyzing like why has our community gotten to this point today? We also have an opportunity to dive into a political vision. As a technologist, I'm very used to imagination, brainstorming, design thinking with all of the Post-it notes. We get to imagine what our world it can be, and we get to build that future. And then finally, in a practical organizing strategy, there's a lot of building, problem solvings, and intervention. And so in my work, it was often developing a product to get there. And so in a lot of our work in Trubel&co Mapping Justice, we're using that process to get there. And I wanted to use this quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore to further articulate it. She says, if justice is embodied, it is therefore always spatial, which is to say, part of the process of making a place. She further says that in abolitionist organizing, we foster new relations, developing new configurations of care and justice making that demand, rehearse, and manifest the world we want. That last part always gets to me, and just thinking through the ways that as we're engaging in this work, as we're contextualizing what abolition means to us, ultimately we're demanding, rehearsing, and manifesting the world we want, and ultimately the world that we deserve. And so in thinking through whether or not this word is quote unquote radical, ultimately it's thinking through how are we making a world in which we're all free. We're gonna demand, like assert what our demands are and our needs are. We're gonna practice, and it's going to manifest itself. And so abolition isn't a static place, it's not a designated status. Truly, it's a North Star when we're accepting that things can be changed because they need to be. It's a practice of radical imagination to experiment with some of these systems, ultimately letting go and building up at the same time. And so this piece about radical imagination is important, and I want to spend some time diving into that as we're thinking about what role civic imagination might play within our world of geospatial analytics. But ultimately, as another personal reflection, thinking about how might these conceptualizations of freedom and abolition shape our own influence on placemaking and working with data, and what role geospatial tools might play in advancing liberation. But I have an activity. I want to dive into this idea of radical imagination because I've always felt that this is the hardest part for technologists to jump into when they are imagining what a future could hold. And so this is the definition of radical imagination we found. At its most superficial, the radical imagination is the ability to imagine the world, life, and social institutions, not as they are, but as they otherwise might be. And so you all are incredibly smart. I'm sure you're able to produce incredible analyses that reflect the history of the world. Oftentimes people have trouble letting go. People have trouble saying, oh, well, what if we had a new system? What if we redesigned it? What if, do we have to exist this way? Does the system have to follow through just because we've done that in the past? And so this is often an activity that we try to bring into our workshops and our youth to let folks, shake it off and be able to reimagine communities for what they are. So there's an activity that we like to call yes and what if. Has anyone done improv before? Yes, one in the back. So there's an activity often within improv that's like a yes and activity. And so the idea is to brainstorm and continue with your sense of thought. You may start a story, it's a lovely day today. The other person continues, yes, and I had a great sandwich. Yes, and oh, but that sandwich had tomatoes and I don't really eat tomatoes. Yes, and did you hear about the company where that tomatoes were sold from? And so it just kind of continues on in this iterative approach. The idea is to build on top of each other. We're adapting it in terms of a yes and what if in order to let us really dive into reimagining the world and the institutions and ideas that we often grapple with. And so for an example, if we were to do this activity with classrooms, I may start it off by saying, what if we all had access to the same quality education? You may continue that and say, yes, and what if students were in charge of their classroom? Yes, and what if we all got to co-design that curriculum? Yes, and what if that curriculum was all about our local environment instead of some national, case study? And so you get a chance to really think through and be bold about the vision that you want, and we get to build on top of each other. So I've never done it this way, but we're going to do it collectively and see how that goes. And so you can just yell out the next yes and so we're going to start off with something a little bit easier because I heard y'all like food. So the first category, food. Again, remember, what are your beautiful visions of a liberatory relationship with food? Mine to start is, what if an apple didn't cost $3? Does anyone want to? And you can just yell or speak up and share, and we're just gonna build off each other.
And food doesn't involve eating animals.
Yes. Yeah.
And what if we didn't have to use a car to get our food?
Ooh.
What if there was a free food hall on every block?
Yeah. Mmm. Spicy. Yeah. Ooh. And there wouldn't be traffic. Love it. Y'all are getting the sense of it. And that's the beauty about this activity, can go in a lot of different directions. We're gonna do it again in relation to nature. What if we could hear, see, and smell our natural environment all the time?
Yes, and what if everyone had access to the same quality?
Yeah. Yes, and what if everyone had access to the same quality of environment?
What if there were no heat islands?
And what if there were no heat islands?
And what if we all had shelter?
What if we all had shelter? Or maybe not.
What if there were greenways everywhere?
Ooh, and what if there are greenways? This area is a little bit quiet. Is your relationship with nature perfect, or are there ways it could improve? Ooh, what if everyone walked to the greenway? What if all the shelters had grass roofs? What if they weren't grass and they were solar panels? One more. Yeah.
for structure around civic society.
I feel that one. Thank you. And so we're going to do one more, just in a small group. This might be in a little bit of a spicy one. And so knowing where we are, I have a lot of thoughts about what academia could be, but feel free to share with a colleague. Maybe we'll do small groups of just 3 or 4, just for a couple minutes. But thinking through your own visions for academia. Maybe like, what if researchers were accountable to the communities where they gather data from? Or what if research was judged by its impact on justice and community instead of which journal it was a part of? And so maybe turn to a peers, groups of like 3 or 4, and just see like what some of the ideas for academia might be. Don't be shy. Sorry, I said it's going to be very much a workshop.
Great.
Oh, is it better? Oh, for the camera. Oh, yeah, yeah, you can. Sorry, I just got stuck. Oh, yeah. Is this better? Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
The cameras never pick up the lights.
Yeah. So let's do fire.
All right. Does anyone want to share any ideas that came from their group? You can be bold and brave. Yeah.
Research actually so rather than you just talking on the problem that you have a community that they have like so they actually do the research to apply it to whatever problem that they're having in order to actually provide a solution rather than just do research and not.
Love that. Thank you for sharing that point. I think that the application of research and how do we expand that, diversify is like really important. Can I get maybe like one more thought on any reflections from the activity? Or how did it feel to dive into this?
Liberating.
Yeah. Absolutely. When I first did an activity like this, honestly, it felt really hard. I was like, oh my gosh, I get to just dream up things that don't exist. But then once I leaned into any idea that I had that, led into these feelings of liberation, right? Like if I could redesign academia, what would it look like? If I could redesign my relationship for food, what would that look like? And it can be intimidating at first. But once I started to lean in, I'm like, oh, I do actually have dozens of ways that this system could be better, that my relationship with nature could be more fulfilling. And I often do this activity to let folks know that we can design those things. These things may seem absurd, like will an apple ever get lower than $3? But in what ways we can really make that work more accessible? In what ways can we make sure that we have the power to really lean into this? These are just like additional future reflections, right? What if we could redesign governance if policy was written by people directly impacted by the issue? Or if technology actually healed instead of perpetually extracted from? Things for us to consider. I know these things are big things, big tech, government. Can we really redesign it? But we never get to that more liberated future unless we actually be bold about our own ideation about how it can better serve ourselves as a community. And so just to share, like, radical imagination and practice has led to a lot of incredible new innovations, right? It's led to labor unions, community land trusts, food sovereignty programs. We get to really reimagine and redesign these systems. And it always starts with the what if. And so when we think about the power of civic imagination, especially in how geospatial analytics might help advance these areas, I always think that it's really important for us to think about our own role, to know our past, to believe in a future, and also do something about it, right? If we don't know our past, it's really hard to figure out what that next step is. We often end up repeating things that we've done before. Things feel eerily familiar, like the current environment kind of feels like this. U.S. has been here before. We also need to think through our role, like believing in that more positive future, leaning in to the uncertainty of imagination. And then every day, every quarter, whatever in our work, what can we do about it? It may not be, these big steps, but maybe step by step, we're able to think through how do we advance towards these goals of liberation. And I also want to acknowledge that it is a scary time for civic imagination today. We're living in a society where a lot of thoughts that are expressed online in digital environments, in person, that folks are actually being persecuted against having these ideas for simply reimagining their community in another way, especially within academic environments. There's a lot of violence happening with students across the US for simply imagining what their community could look like. So I just want to acknowledge this, name this, but also show that without that ability to imagine, we're never going to get to that future that we so deserve. And so it is something that's scary, but it's something that we all have the right to do, even though we may think and modulate how do we express that and how do we engage in communities in order to move forward. I wanted to show some visual examples of ways that folks are engaging in what I see as parts of civic imagination, and also doing their work to make sure that as we think through the world of geospatial analytics, we're knowing our past and we're documenting. I felt like this 2025 has been a wild year, obviously, but I feel like every month has had like a whole different flavor of like, what are the rights that I need to protect and how do we use maps in order to protect that? Some of you may know of some of the tools like the EJ screen or the CGES tool. These were sadly taken down within a week of the change of administration in the US. These are tools that were paid for by our tax dollars to get real data about what's happening in our community in terms of what's happening with the environment. These tools were taken down, but a lot of efforts from groups like the Public Environmental Data Partners have been committed to preserving and providing access to this work. And so even though that there are some forces that don't want us to know what's happening in our community, there are groups that are using maps and visual information to protect it. This is heavily run by different volunteers and volunteer organizations putting this forward. But thankfully, because of them, we still have access to these critical tools to know what are the environmental harms happening in our backyard and who is it mostly affecting. I feel like we got to February into March, and then we saw all of the government layoffs. And so this was work done by another volunteer to figure out, we need to know what is happening. And so they wanted to put a map to really articulate what the different what are the different effects of the federal layoffs and where was it aggregated. And so they wanted to think through across infrastructure, energy, defense, food, education, where were these layoffs happening? Again, through an effort of using their ability to map and document to make sure that we had this legacy of understanding what to do. And similarly, another volunteer effort using their skills in geospatial analytics to make sure that we know what's happening around us. This is work that happened, in the past few weeks. There's been a lot of international student visas that are being revoked for simply sharing their ideas for how their communities can be better. This was an article I found as of April 10th. Over 100 colleges have identified 600 plus international students that had changed their legal status by the State Department because of something they've posted online, a place that they've went and engaged in. Similarly, in engaging this work, this is where you're seeing another confluence of technology that may be seen as, oh, it could just be positive, but they're actually using social media. They're using various forms of geospatial tracking. They're diving into these accounts in order to use that technology for their own purposes and their own agenda. So we see this map of understanding. Folks may hear about it a little bit on the news, but it's also another thing to see it all visualized. I didn't know that there were 600 students who have had their status revoked because of some of these policies in this agenda, and to see that it's not just concentrated in one area, but affecting all of the US. I imagine in a couple of weeks, we'll see a similar map on the effect of tariffs. So we're seeing this influence of ways that folks are using their skills in order to document some of this work. I often think also about how geospatial analytics might fit into roles of civic action. What are we doing in order to take a step forward? And so this was, it's called different things. Some call it a wheel of social justice and activity. I like to use it as just an example of we all have different roles to play. And this may be something to consider, especially as you're imagining what role within civic imagination, what role within equity and justice do I want to take part? Whether it's telling a story, healing within communities, being a frontline responder, caregiving, weaving, experimenting. There are many roles that we may play. These have different levels of comfort, of safety, of relationship with privilege and oppression. I like to get folks to think through the ways that their own role and their own skill set, specifically here within geospatial analytics, might be used to advance some of these areas on wherever you may feel comfortable. Maybe you want to do some of the work that we just saw and storytell and use maps and dashboards to show what's happening in your community. Maybe you're able to use maps to guide frontline responders over here's where you should go to target your interventions. These are the people that are most impacted and need more resources right now. And so thinking about the ways we can use some of this technical skill set to advance our visions for liberation. And so I want to use the rest of the time just to dive into how trubel&co actually engages in this work. And a lot of it is through youth education. And so in our program, Mapping Justice, we champion high schoolers to design geospatial tools for social change while centering identity and place within STEM. In its core, they're learning GIS. They get a crash course in about 6 to 8 weeks. Secondly, they get a curriculum in race, power, and technology. We're diving into responsible tech, ethical AI, misinformation. We get to read incredible critical texts like Ruha Benjamin, Sophia Noble, diving into the ways that identity, place, and power intersects within these fields of data and analysis and technology that we're hoping to dive into. And then finally, we tell them to go change the world. They have a student capstone. They start off the process by thinking through a big wicked problem in their community, and they spend the time as they're learning GIS to conceptualize what's the problem, why has it occurred, and where can we go from here? And then this is one of my favorite quotes from the course. A student last year shared, this course will flip your relationships with maps upside down. It'll teach you how to create maps that highlight serious justice issues, give you the opportunity to connect with curious and assertive peers, and help you begin your journey as an activist, data scientist, or whatever change maker you wish to be. Building the skill set ultimately. Whether or not they end up in graduate school at the Center for Geospatial Analytics, like that'd be great. But ultimately really thinking about the ways that they're engaged in data literacy to advance whatever passion they have, whether they want to be a doctor, a journalist, a policymaker, thinking through how spatial analytics might inform that. In doing this, we're adopting that framework that we've been discussing, right? How does abolition fit into this world? Where does liberation and civic imagination fit? Well, they're exploring these drivers of social inequity, so that analysis of oppression we mentioned, by understanding why did we get here? They are bold in imagining this society that's driven by their own specific feelings of liberation, whether that means the joy in the community or whatever things we shared before in that Slido. And then they're taking action by designing these geo tools to direct change. Students have looked at transgender voter discrimination and thinking through how we might mobilize and support those affected by that, while also looking at how we might identify and assist communities that are experiencing disproportionate fast food influence. Why maps? You all get the power of maps, but this was like an instance from earlier this year where we see maps as legacy. People accept maps as truth. People also really engage with maps, and it's something that feels very visceral. They see like, I know that place, I know what's going on, and people see the power that they have. But oftentimes maps aren't just reality, they are decisions. We have to question as we are engaging in map making, whose voices were present in the creation of this? What choices were made? What isn't being shown? The picture here is from when we just decided that this is now the Gulf of America. I'm from Texas, and so I'm pretty familiar with this Gulf, and that's never how I engaged it. But the folks in power had an authority to change it for their own population. And so we often use maps as a way of conveying information and asserting truth. And so we think about the ways that maps are a really powerful way to get folks engaged in this work. Who determines a border? who gets to name a contested occupied land, who is actually allowed to rewrite history. This is the power that we have when we're creating maps and putting it out into the world. And so using the geographic approach, students are answering a wide spectrum of questions. I got to meet some of you at the lunch, and you'll have such incredible projects. We're trying to bring that same vitality of information gathering to 16-year-olds. And so they are exploring, depicting the economic effect of local gentrification to visualizing the effect that environmental disasters like Hurricane Helene has on different forms of migration patterns. Students are looking at what's going on in their immediate community, this was a group of students that were based in New York, looking at the efficacy of after-school programs. How does that overlap with juvenile crime? Can they understand different correlations to how one intervention might affect another? They're taking historical tools, like when the EJ screen existed, and being able to bring them to their own understanding of what is going on in their neighborhood. Do I know that I live in an environmentally risky neighborhood? What does that mean? What is affecting that? What's the legacy around that? Maybe we can connect tools like this to histories of redlining and understand, oh, there's a reason I don't have access to green space. There's a reason everyone in my neighborhood has asthma. This is actually a legacy of something that happened, years ago. So they're bringing in historical maps as well to inform their analysis and understanding of their world, and being able to compare that across the different dimensions they care about, from employment, home ownership, and poverty rates. For time, I may skip through this, but these are just like case studies of some of the student work. This was from our pilot in Hawaii. This goes to the story map. It's also on our website, where they're exploring some of these issues, where they wanted to understand how the Lahaina fires in Maui affected economic equity and food access. And similarly with this group, kind of thinking through the economics of environmental health, especially post-disaster. They were trying to understand how the distribution of industrial facilities and landfills impacted various elements of environmental injustice on their islands. And so in doing this work, I always like to remind folks that we have a responsibility to know our collective past, but we also have a right to imagine these liberatory futures. And ultimately, as placemakers and as geospatial analysts, we should aim to give communities the tools to bridge that gap. This is just a little bit about our work and what we do at Trubel&Co. Since I've been able to build it. We are scattered in a lot of places. We do Mapping Justice, our summer program with MIT, also along the Gulf in Hawaii. We do workshops in a few different places, and we have some places scoped out. North Carolina is not on those lists. Maybe it could be. Would love to work with any of you in the room. If you're inspired by any of this work and you think that you should have the power to redesign their own communities, and just like things that I just wanted to share in terms of our broader work, we're always looking for more ways to spark good trouble. We work with universities and other partners to bring mapping justice and shorter term workshops. We also hire geospatial justice facilitators. We hire a lot of folks who are nerdy about GIS and want to bring this to youth and talk about how they can use it to improve their community. And then this is actually kind of new. This is a group that we're starting called Superscript that's open to the community. It's a book club plus that we like to call it. And we're currently talking about this intersection of radical technology and climate justice. Currently, we're reading a book called Why We Fear AI, kind of thinking about the intersection of tech, environment, and governmental structures. But just wanted to share more about the work, ways to be involved, and I always love to close it in quotes. This is something that's been grounding me, Black Liturgies. For those who know Cole Arthur Riley, she shares, if your hope is waning, find those who can sustain it. And when the time comes, you will carry someone else's hope for them. No individual can resist despair on their own. We steady each other. We can't afford despair. She often has an inhale, exhale as a way to affirm ourselves and ground ourselves. So she shares, inhale, there is wisdom in the singer. Exhale, I listen for clarity. And so if you ever need an affirmation as we're going through these hairy times, love a little piece of Black Liturgies and some things from Mariam Kaba. But I think we're at time, but thank you so much, and happy to take questions for however long they'll let me stay up here.
Questions? Thanks a lot for this presentation. It was awesome. Yeah, I'm just wondering what you mean by ethical AI. There's, they talk about at least as far as like large language models,
Yeah.
how what they're trained on, the training data is maybe not ethically sourced or what have you, and then like these applications that they're using for like weaponization. So like what's your take on what ethical AI would be?
Yeah, it's a super broad term, and it's looking at all of these types of technologies and whether or not things should or shouldn't be done with communities and understanding the nature about that. A lot of the realm of ethical AI, like the questioning, is around where is it, how is it trained, both from how is the data being extracted. We've all probably saw those Ghibli pictures come up through ChatGPT. There's questions about that where Ghibli has literally said multiple times, "I hate AI. This is shit." This is like things that he has said verbatim. But then his work, his creative, ownership is being commodified and used, and maybe some people even making a profit based on that. Some of it's also questioning how is it trained. There's a lot of use of AI in prediction, and so if I think through predictive AI in terms of policing, it's using data sets in order to determine where should we send folks because this is where we think more crime will occur. But if that data is then biased, right? If we're sending folks to where we think crime will be because that's where we have previously sent folks, then we're leaning ourselves into this pattern. And so you often see AI replicate these biases that exist in our physical world, but it's multiplied, 100-fold because it's making these decisions automatically.
Your program with the high schoolers, is it online or do you go in person to put these on? Like how does that all work?
Yeah, it's mostly virtual, but it's very place-based. And so all the work that we do in Florida is very different from what we do in Hawaii. The majority of the instruction is delivered over Zoom and Slack and Google Classroom. But then if there's funding, we like to close it in an in-person showcase. And so last year, after our 6-week program in Hawaii, I was forced to Honolulu for 3 days to meet the staff, and the students got to share their work. We invited local professors, policymakers, environmental advocates to engage with the youth, ask questions. And so we like to try to build that in when possible.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you for this presentation. It was really great. Do you foresee this being adapted to like a college level, like an undergraduate level format?
I definitely think it could. And so it's really introductory, but I don't think any of the work um, I think it could easily be adapted at a college level. There's also additional ways like we thought about mapping justice 2 and 3. It's very a baseline in terms of the technical skills that we use. We're using ArcGIS online. They're using various tools there from dashboard story maps, some of the instant apps as well. One, the rigor could be increased in terms of the level of data gathering students are doing. We try to make it very easy because we know the world of data can be hard and intimidating if you've never done it before. So we try to clean and prepare these data sets. You could have a more investigative approach with students learning that process themselves and also building upon the complexity of the tools, as well as integrating various geo AI, other technologies that are utilized or expanding beyond the Esri ArcGIS platform. And to that note, we've done trainings with the majority of our work, let's say 90% of our work is with high school students, but we've trained college students, we've worked with young adults, I have a workshop coming up later with older retired elders who are civic leaders in St. Louis to understand data for civic action. So there are a lot of ways to bring this curriculum and adapt it to the need.
Thanks, Nick. Can you talk some about what you've learned, you and your staff from like through the process, what you're gaining from the high school students, the questions they're asking, how they're playing yes and what if, and how you're then adapting it into Trubel&Co moving forward?
Absolutely. Really good question. I think one, they're so bright. They pick up ArcGIS like really quickly, and they're really engaged in being able to like drive this to like explore the issues they care about. I also get a sense of like, or should I say, I'm reminded about how rigid our typical public school education is. That students are almost scared to engage in this work. They're not allowed to like dive into radical imagination in their personal or professional, academic lives. And so there's often sometimes a little bit of resistance because we don't often get spaces for civic discourse. We'll have a topic around climate gentrification, looking at the fact that in a lot of areas, such as in Miami, where we do some work, students are experiencing this other form of gentrification, or because of disasters or sea level rise, folks are moving from maybe more affluent neighborhoods along the coast into more environmentally secure neighborhoods that are often populated by BIPOC populations. Those people are then pushed out. And so what is this occurrence? And so we're seeing a resistance of like, can I actually talk about this even if they've seen it? And how do we foster discourse across a variety of different perspectives? And so it's always been refreshing being able to provide that space for students.
Thanks. Nice presentation. I'm curious, do you have any plans to scale Trubel to like the international stage? And what do you think that would look like?
That's a really good question. I think it's hard for a couple of reasons. One, I think there's always a question of data availability, and so like, what data sets are we gathering? I remember a couple years ago I had a group of girls who, in their like big wicked problem, they both said that they're their families from Ghana and they're interested in public health. So I'm like, great, y'all figured something out. And they hit an issue of like, oh, the data that everyone else is using is not the data that we can use. How do we do that? I think it's definitely possible, but I think the other complication may be around cultural context. How I engage with race, power, class is very different from what happens in Thailand. It's very different from what happens in Europe. And so I'm thinking about, I think it's definitely at that basis there, but we would probably, if we were to go international, we need to do a lot of work with local teachers, leaders, environmental advocates to figure out how do you contextualize the nature of the work. Our process of teaching a skill, sure, but anyone can teach GIS. How do you teach GIS in a way that's culturally competent and aligned to their own visions of liberation? And so open door, but we probably need some international partners to get there.
Thanks. What becomes of the projects that some of the students create? Like, are they, maintained for them to access for some amount of time so that they can show off what they've done if they're like, I don't know, applying for a job, applying for college, whatnot?
Yeah, I think all of our students use their projects in their portfolio, in their college app. Students have been able to get into a wide variety of schools because of their projects. I've had students who they did the class right before their senior year. By like August, they emailed me saying, hey, Nick, I actually got an internship at my local Parks and Rec. Yes, I'm 17, but they couldn't hire anybody else. And so my skills knowing GIS immediately gave me that opportunity. So we house the projects on our website and on our GIS platform. And we're also hoping that in the future, ensuring that these projects aren't just isolated to issues that they're wanting to explore, but also issues that communities are immediately facing. And so how do we better bridge the gap between their students' work in a local advocacy group or an environmental organization so they can then say, great, we're using your story map. This dashboard is visualizing our work. And so there's a more tangible impact in what the students are doing as well beyond themselves.
Cool. Thanks.
So I'm an open source maintainer, and so what's the role of open source in your work? Because you talked about ArcGIS, and that kind of triggered me.
Fairly so.
Like, why do you force people use proprietary software that will oppress them? And
No, fair question. And many internal staff also have the same questions. I have nothing against open source. I think some of the reasons why it's hard. One of the reasons why we continue to use ArcGIS is because we acknowledge it as the current leader in a market-ready skill in GIS, and it's one of the more notable ones. And so if we're thinking about, especially for the communities that we're working with, Black and brown folks that often are coming and looking for economic mobility, we wanted an opportunity that would be readily recognizable for them to be able to get that job, get that internship. And we also see an opportunity that these skills are transferable. yes, it's not the same as QGIS, it's not the same as Felt, it's not the same as all of these tools. But if you've learned GIS and you're excited about it, it's not that big of a jump to then go into QGIS. In terms of why this has been our grounding, we see it a bit easier to jump into because it's cloud-based, it's very plug and play. It kind of removes again, some of the hard work in GIS. And so for an introduction, we want it to be as streamlined as possible. That's not to say in mapping justice 2 or 3. As I was mentioning, we want to bring in a wider variety of technologies if we were to continue working with those students. Like that's something that we definitely would want to do. And we've been exploring the ways that our workshops can also make use of some of the other work. I had flagged public environmental data partners as a group. And so we're hoping to collaborate and think through how folks can use existing geospatial open source data sets that they don't need a login for in order to do this work. And so we're hoping to expand on that, but really good question.
Thank you.
I think we're at time, Nick, so I will say yes. And what if we continue the conversation the rest of the afternoon, the rest of this year, and throughout the Geospatial Center. So thanks a lot for joining us today.
Of course.